How well do you really know the person sleeping next to you? I don't mean that in the abstract, philosophical way, the kind of question you ask yourself during a long drive or a sleepless night, and then set aside because the answer, whatever it is, doesn't change your morning. I mean it in the specific, concrete, unsettling way of someone who has thought carefully about what it actually takes to deceive another human being completely. For a year, for 5 years, for a decade. Because deception at that scale is not a single choice. It is thousands of choices, made every day, in every conversation, in every moment when the truth might accidentally surface and has to be pushed back down. It is an act of sustained, deliberate construction, a second architecture built alongside the real one, maintained with the same care and attention, requiring constant vigilance to keep the two from ever touching. Most people couldn't do it. Most people would crack under the weight of it within weeks. The guilt, the logistics, the sheer cognitive load of keeping two complete lives separate and functional, most people are simply not built for it. William Hartley was built for it, or so he believed. Today, I want to tell you the story of two women who had never met, who lived 2 hours apart, who had built their lives around the same man and had no idea the other existed. And the rainy night in Chicago when an ordinary car accident ended 10 years of a lie so complete, so carefully maintained, so exhaustively constructed that the people closest to him had never had a reason to doubt a single thing he told them. And then what those two women did when they found out. Let's begin with Alice. Alice Hartley was 41 years old, the kind of person her friends described as unshakable. She had met William when they were both in their late 20s. She was working in hospital administration in Chicago. He was a junior pilot for a regional carrier. And he had walked into her life with the easy confidence of a man who understood exactly how he came across and had decided to use it generously. He was handsome in the squared-off, reliable way of men who look good in uniforms, and the uniform was a not inconsiderable part of the picture. He was attentive, funny, and genuinely interested in her in a way that she found, after several years of less attentive men, almost disorienting in its sincerity. They married when she was 30. They had their first child 2 years later, and their second a year after that. The house in the northern suburbs of Chicago was more than she had expected when she was young, and just beginning to map out what a life might look like. She worked part-time in hospital management while the children were young, then returned to full-time when they were in school. She was competent and organized, and she ran her life with a quiet efficiency that William sometimes described to friends as the reason everything worked. William's career had grown steadily. He flew international routes now, long-haul flights that took him to Frankfurt and Dubai and Singapore, that kept him away for 3 or 4 days at a time, on a rotating schedule that Alice had long since internalized as simply the nature of their life together. She did not love the absences. She managed them. She had a system, a network of friends, a support structure, a way of organizing the household and the children's schedules that did not depend on William being present, because dependence on his presence was not something she could afford. This had been, in its own quiet way, a form of preparation for something she did not know was coming. She trusted him. This is the part that people always want to analyze, always want to find the flaw in, as though trust itself were a form of naivety that sophisticated people avoid. She trusted him because he had given her no reason not to. He was home when he said he would be home. He called when he was away, every day without exception, at a time they had agreed on years earlier, and he had never broken. He was present at the children's events, attentive at the dinners with her parents, warm and apparently genuine in all the ways that matter to someone paying attention over a decade. If there was something wrong, it did not show. Now let's go 2 hours north. Brenda Hartley was 38 years old and lived in a house in the suburbs of Milwaukee with her 2 children and the belief that her husband was a commercial pilot who worked international routes and was away from home for 3 or 4 days at a time on a rotating schedule. She had met William at a conference in 2013. She was in corporate event management. He was in the hotel bar where the conference was being held. and the story of how they met was one she had told so many times that it had acquired the polished quality of a family anecdote. He had approached her. He had been attentive. He had called the next day and the day after that, and within 8 months they were engaged, and within 14 months they were married, and within 2 years she had her first child, and within 4 she had her second. She had no reason to think anything was wrong either. The schedule was consistent. The calls came daily, at the agreed time. He was home when he said he would be. He attended the children's events. He was present and warm with her parents, who liked him, and with her friends, who found him charming, and with her own instincts, which told her everything was as it appeared to be, because those instincts had no information to suggest otherwise. William, between these two households, had constructed a life that required the precision of an air traffic control system. He maintained a shared calendar with each woman that never overlapped. He had separate phones, one for each life, and had developed the habit, so deeply ingrained by now that it no longer required conscious thought, of knowing at all times which phone was which, and which life he was currently inhabiting. He had separate bank accounts for each household, funded from a salary that was, after years of seniority and promotions, substantial enough to support 2 complete domestic lives, without either woman noticing anything unusual about the finances available to her. He had told each woman different things about his family of origin: a dead father, an estranged mother, a story calibrated to minimize the occasions on which family intersections might occur. And the stories had held because he told them consistently, and with the particular conviction of someone who has told a lie so many times that it has become, functionally, his truth. For 10 years, not a single thing went wrong. And then it rained in Chicago. The night of November 14th was wet in a way that the Midwest gets wet in November. Not dramatically, not with thunder or wind, just a steady, cold, relentless rain that made the roads slick and the visibility poor, and the driving on the expressways a thing that required more attention than it usually got. William was on the 290 heading west. He had a flight in the morning, an overnight layover schedule that would have given him 2 days in Milwaukee before the next Chicago rotation. He was, by any reasonable measure, fine. Not tired, not distracted in any unusual way, just a man driving home in the rain after an ordinary day. The car skidded. The details of exactly what happened are not completely clear even from the accident reconstruction, but what is clear is that the vehicle left the road at approximately 60 miles an hour and made contact with a concrete barrier in a way that was serious enough to trigger the full deployment of every safety system the car had, and still leave William with a fractured pelvis, 4 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and a traumatic brain injury severe enough to put him in a medically induced coma by the time the paramedics arrived. He was taken to Northwestern Memorial Hospital by ambulance. He was alive, but not responsive. He had no identification on him that the first responders could immediately locate. What he had was a phone. Hospital protocol in cases like this is designed to move quickly and to prioritize notification of family. A nurse went through the phone, the Chicago phone, as it happened, the one that was in his jacket pocket, and found the emergency contacts. Alice's number was listed first. Her name was listed as wife. She called. Alice received the call at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. She had been asleep. The call was from a hospital nurse, and the specific quality of the words a hospital nurse uses when calling about a serious accident is a quality that cuts through sleep immediately and completely. She was in her car within 7 minutes. She called her neighbor to come stay with the children. She drove to Northwestern Memorial with the particular focus of someone who has set everything else entirely aside and is operating on a single directive. She arrived at the hospital at 12:23 in the morning. She was taken to a family waiting room, the kind of room that hospitals build for exactly these situations, with chairs that are almost comfortable and lighting that is almost bright, and a television mounted near the ceiling that was showing something with the sound off. She sat down. A doctor came and spoke to her about William's condition, which was serious but stable, and about the coma, which was medically induced to allow his brain to rest and recover, and about the fractures and the lung and the general picture, which was one of significant injury and significant uncertainty. She listened to all of it and said the things that people say in those moments, and then sat back down in the almost comfortable chair and held herself together in the way that people who are very good at holding themselves together do when there is no other option. She had been sitting there for 21 minutes when the waiting room door opened. The woman who came through it was running, or something close to running, the contained, urgent movement of someone who has been moving as fast as possible through hospital corridors and has just arrived at the place they needed to reach. She was crying. She was holding her phone. She said to the first person she saw, who happened to be a hospital administrator passing through, that she was looking for her husband, that she had been called about an accident, that his name was William Hartley. Alice heard the name. She stood up. The woman who had just come through the door, Brenda, though Alice did not know that yet, turned toward the movement and saw a woman standing up in the family waiting room with an expression that Brenda would later describe, in the conversations that followed, as the most frightening thing she had ever seen on a stranger's face. Not because it was angry, because it was recognizing something. The nurse who had made the initial calls came into the waiting room at that moment to check on the family. She looked at Alice, who was standing. She looked at Brenda, who had frozen near the door. She said, with the professional calm of someone who is beginning to understand that this situation is not what she expected it to be, that she needed to speak with William's wife. Both women said, at the same moment, in voices that were almost identical in their uncertainty, that they were his wife. The silence that followed that moment is something both women have described separately and with the same word: absolute. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too large to fit inside ordinary noise. A television with the sound off. Two women looking at each other across a hospital waiting room. A nurse who is a trained professional and would later say that in 18 years of nursing, she had never experienced anything quite like the next 30 seconds. They sat down. They did not do this consciously exactly. It was more that sitting down was the only possible response to what their bodies were registering. The nurse, who was more composed than either of them had any right to expect, arranged for a private space and asked a hospital social worker to come and be present. And within 15 minutes, Alice and Brenda were sitting in a small conference room with a social worker and a box of tissues and the slowly assembling ruins of two lives. Have you ever tried to imagine what that conversation was like? Two women who had both built their lives around the same man, who had both believed the same things, who had both been given no reason to doubt and had not doubted, sitting across from each other and beginning to lay out the architecture of their respective realities, and watching it fit together in a way that made everything suddenly, horribly clear. Alice had been married to William for 11 years. Brenda had been married to him for 9. The overlap was 2 years of what Alice knew as the end of their engagement and early marriage, and what Brenda knew as the beginning of their relationship. They compared dates. They compared the stories he had told each of them about his schedule, his family, his colleagues, his history. They compared the specific rhythms of his presence and absence. The rotating schedule that had always made sense, had always had a logic, a pattern, an explanation, revealed itself as they compared notes, as the rotation it actually was. 3 days here, 4 days there. The machinery of a double life laid bare in a hospital conference room at 2 a.m. Both women had children. Between them, William had 4. He had been present for the births of all 4. He had attended school plays and sports days and birthday parties in 2 cities, maintaining 2 sets of memories with 2 sets of people, 2 versions of a father, 2 versions of a husband, all of it running concurrently for the better part of a decade. The rage that both women describe feeling in that room is something I want to be careful about, because it was not simple and it was not clean. There was rage, yes, the specific, almost physical rage of someone who has been deceived at the most fundamental level of their life, whose entire understanding of their own history has just been revealed as constructed by someone else for purposes that had nothing to do with them. But there was also, underneath the rage, something more complicated, a grief that was not only for the marriage, but for the version of themselves that had existed inside the marriage. The person who had believed, who had trusted, who had organized their entire life around a foundation that turned out to be built on something that had no foundation at all. What they did not do at any point in that conversation was turn on each other. This is the part of the story that matters most to me. Not because it is surprising exactly, but because in the version of this story that people expect, the version that culture has prepared them for, two women in that situation fight. They blame each other, or one blames the other, or they become competitors in a landscape of victimhood where there is only enough sympathy for one of them. What actually happened was that both women, within about an hour of sitting in that conference room, had reached the same conclusion independently and simultaneously. They were not each other's problem. They were each other's only real ally. The person responsible for what had happened to both of them was down the hall in an ICU, and he was currently unconscious. And that meant there was a window of time available to them that would not be available once he was awake. They used it. The financial accounts were the first priority. Alice was familiar enough with William's banking, as the longer-standing wife, to know where the primary accounts were held. Brenda had information about the secondary accounts he had used with her. Together, with the legal standing as spouses that gave them access to shared marital accounts, they began the process of consolidating and securing assets. What they found as they worked through it over the following days with the help of two separate attorneys who were eventually brought into coordination was that William had been more careful with the money than with almost anything else. But careful was not the same as untouchable. And with two wives and two attorneys and a man who was in no position to make any calls, careful turned out to be insufficient. The airline was the second priority. William's employer, a major international carrier based at O'Hare, had a code of conduct that included provisions for conduct unbecoming. Bigamy, it turned out, qualified. Alice made the call. Brenda sent the documentation. The airline's HR and legal departments moved with a speed that reflected both the seriousness of the situation and the liability implications of having a pilot whose personal conduct raised questions about his judgment and honesty. His employment was terminated before he regained consciousness. The criminal matter was the third priority, and this one required more time and more attorneys, and a clearer picture of the documentation than the other two. Bigamy is a crime in Illinois and in Wisconsin. It is not aggressively prosecuted. District attorneys have significant discretion about how they allocate resources. But it is on the books, and when two women with good attorneys present a case that is as thoroughly documented as Alice and Brenda's became, district attorneys tend to find it hard to look the other way. Charges were filed in both states. William was in a coma for 19 days. The recovery, when it began, was slow in the way that recoveries from traumatic brain injuries are slow. Not linear, not predictable, marked by periods of apparent progress and periods of plateau, and the constant uncertainty of a body and a mind that have been seriously damaged and are doing their own internal accounting about what to repair and in what order. The medical staff were professional and attentive. The physical therapy team began working with him as soon as he was stable enough. The room was quiet most of the time because there were no visitors. None of his family, his parents, a brother, had been notified in ways that had reached them promptly. His friends were, for the most part, friends of his two domestic lives, and those two domestic lives had been in conversation with each other for weeks by that point. He did not know any of this. He was in a hospital bed, doing the work of recovering, with no information about what was happening outside the room. When he was finally conscious and coherent enough to have a conversation, a hospital social worker came to speak with him first, before anyone else. The social worker was trained for difficult conversations and conducted this one with professionalism. She told him that his situation had become known. She told him that the documentation was comprehensive. She did not tell him everything, because everything was more than could be covered in a single conversation with someone who had just come out of 19 days of unconsciousness. She stepped out. A police officer who had been waiting in the corridor stepped in. He was alone in the way that is different from simply having no one in the room. He was alone in the specific, complete sense of someone whose entire constructed reality has been removed while they were not in a position to defend it. 2 marriages dissolved. 4 children being cared for by their mothers in homes that he was no longer legally or practically part of. A career terminated. A financial position that was significantly worse than the one he had been managing when his car hit the barrier on the 290. A legal situation that was going to require the kind of sustained attention and expense that people in significantly better financial positions than his current one find difficult to manage. He had built something extraordinary in its terrible way. The engineering of a double life at that scale, maintained for a decade without a significant failure, that represents a kind of focus and discipline that most people do not possess. The question of where those qualities might have led if they had been directed differently is not one I want to spend time on, because the direction he chose was the direction he chose, and the consequences of it were the consequences. The rainy night on the 290 was an accident. What happened after it was not. Alice has spoken about the experience in terms that I find, of everything I have read about this case, the most useful. She said that the worst part was not the discovery. The worst part was the retroactive quality of it, the way it reached back through 11 years and altered the meaning of things she had believed were one thing and now understood were another. The vacations, the anniversaries, the ordinary evenings, the births of the children, which she could not retroactively unknow, but now carried an additional dimension she had not known was there. The way that every genuine thing, and some things were genuine, some of what she had experienced in that marriage was real, in the way that human experience is always real, regardless of the context, was now inseparable from the scaffolding of deception around it. She said that meeting Brenda was, paradoxically, the thing that made it possible to get through it. Not because having company in a disaster makes the disaster smaller, it doesn't, but because Brenda was the only other person in the world who understood the specific texture of this particular disaster, and there is something in that kind of understanding that nothing else provides. They are not, by their own account, close friends. They have stayed in contact because there are legal and logistical matters that require it, and because their children are, in a technical sense, siblings, and that reality will need to be managed over time in ways that neither of them has fully mapped out yet. But they have a relationship that is its own category, something that does not have an existing name, because the circumstances that created it do not have an existing name. I want to say one final thing before I leave you with this story. William Hartley was not careless. He was not reckless in the way of someone who doesn't think through consequences. He was extraordinarily careful, for an extraordinarily long time, about an extraordinarily large number of things. What undid him was not a lapse in his planning. It was a rainy night and a patch of wet road, and the ordinary randomness of a world that does not coordinate its behavior with anyone's contingency plans. There is a version of this story in which the accident doesn't happen, and the planning holds for another 5 years, or 10, or until the children are grown, and the whole elaborate construction somehow quietly dissolves. That version exists. It is not this version. In this version, a nurse looked at a phone. In this version, 2 women sat down in a waiting room. In this version, 2 people who had every reason to turn on each other looked at the situation clearly enough to understand that the problem was not each other. The lesson, if there is one, is not about trust. Trust is not the thing this story is about. The thing this story is about is what happens when 2 people, who have been individually managed and isolated and deceived, find each other and stop being isolated. The lie that William maintained for 10 years was possible in part because the 2 people most affected by it never had any reason to be in the same room. The moment they were, the lie was over. Be careful who underestimates you, and be very careful who you think you have managed completely, because the one thing you cannot manage is the rain.